From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hello and welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. Today, my guest is Suzy Clausen. And Suzy, I'm so glad we're on both sides of the border here today,
Yes.
both experiencing snow when we don't feel we should be experiencing snow.
Not here in April.
No, that's the way it goes. So welcome. And the first question that I have for you is to give people a little bit about your background, but then I want you to work your way to when you first learned about the term psych health and safety.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marianne. My background by training and education, I'm a licensed professional counselor. So I started working in, face-to-face individual counseling and coaching. Got involved, placed in an employee assistance program, and that's where I really started to understand workplace mental health. That was kind of my first real job. And I've been in that space ever since. I've always worked in workplace mental health on both the vendor side, working in EAPs, the employer side, where I oversaw behavioral health and EAP and workplace violence consultations, et cetera. And then even on the consulting side, where I then consulted with employers about mental health strategies, et cetera. So it's in my blood to do this work. And where I first learned about kind of that term, psychological health and safety, was when I was on the employer side. I worked in a manufacturing company, a really big manufacturing company, where I was a behavioral health coordinator there. And it was one of the roles I had there. As you can imagine, you wear many hats if you are a behavioral health expert in a manufacturing company. But I managed psychiatric disability claims. And so all of our employees that had to go off work for anything from depression, anxiety to schizophrenia, suicide attempt, et cetera. When I managed those claims, I definitely saw some really tragic and very sad cases and oversaw those. But a lot of my cases also came through with things like workplace conflict, burnout, workplace stress, that was the diagnosis. And at first I was, kind of taken aback, like, no, I can't approve claims. Everyone's stressed at work. Like, what do you mean? But as I got to see more and more that when, if we'd have downsizing or organizational changes, I started to realize that people just were feeling like they weren't important. They felt like their voices couldn't be heard. They didn't feel comfortable maybe speaking out to their manager. And that's when I started to, I think it was Amy Edmondson's work that I came across, and was like, oh my gosh, this is happening. People don't feel like it's okay to bring their whole self to work. They don't feel like it's okay to ask questions. And this starts to impact them and it gets disabling. So that's probably where it first came across to me.
Yeah, that idea that the work stress can have an impact on our mental and physical health. And I'll just say, Suzy, for our Canadian listeners, that behavioral health is not a term that we use. We use mental health. But when I heard that term a decade or more ago from my American colleagues, it makes sense. It's the health issues that affect our behavior at work. So tell us a little bit about how that changed how you did your work, how you responded to these types of claims.
There was a big shift, not only to, like I said, understanding psychological health and safety. A big piece of this for me too was understanding that, because as I kind of mentioned, when we would see organizational changes and downsizing, my caseload would always go up. There would always be more people reaching out. And I started to, in some part of me would get a little bit jaded. It's like, hey, I'm in the same boat as you. I'm worried about being let go. If we're letting go of employees, I'm there with you. But how come I can work and you have a doctor saying that you can't work? And after I kind of hit this, you hear of people saying, oh, someone's milking the system, or, just trying to pull the wool, they're malingering. And I had some of those feelings. And then somehow it kind of struck me. I was like, when you feel like your employer doesn't value you, when you feel like they don't value the work that you do, when you lose that sense of meaning, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, it really starts to manifest and look and act a whole lot like depression and anxiety. When you think about the criteria for being diagnosed with depression, if you look at the PHQ, right, like lack of interest in activities, loss of motivation, inability or eating more, sleeping more, all of those different criteria, those same things happen for someone that was pulled from a job they love and placed on a different team where they don't know, the role they're doing. They have a new boss. They also suddenly feel like, well, hey, I found purpose and meaning here, and now I don't know what I'm doing, and now I'm not eating, and now I'm not sleeping, and I go to my doctor and I take a PHQ, and guess what? Now I have a diagnosis of depression. Maybe I'm getting an antidepressant prescribed, when all that's really happening is I need to feel that sense of accomplishment again, a feeling of belonging again. I want to feel like I'm part of a team again. And so having that, after I went through that experience, is when I started to really realize that, here in the States, we talk about 1 in 5, right? 1 in 5 Americans have a diagnosable mental health condition. And I don't have enough research to prove this, but sometimes I want to say, I don't know, maybe it's 1 in 8 do, and 1 in 4 or 5 just have a, complete no sense of meaning or belonging in their life. And it's not really a chemical imbalance. It's just they need to find meaningful work. They need to feel they belong, included, etc.
Mhm. So, Susie, one thing that you said, and we're going to come back to the 1 in 5 as well, but one thing that you said is that you were kind of having that reaction. Well, everybody's got stress and I've got stress and we're all going through this, which is such a common reaction for leaders because leaders have so much pressure and demand put on them. And they're listening to these people, what they might say, whining and complaining. How did you come from that to turning around and going, wait a minute, maybe there's something valid here. Maybe it is real and maybe I can do something.
Deep down, it's from my own personal experience. And like anyone, I think in this field, you've gone through something on your own, or you've had someone else close to you go through something with mental health to make it become alive and important for you. And I've struggled with mental health issues as early as 12 years old, on and off, and was even through my college years, really, really struggled. I had to drop out for a semester to take care of my mental health and get better. But something happened though. After I had my first child, I had severe postpartum depression. And it was like a depression that I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It was traumatic, just horrifying of how paranoid and delusional I became. But after I got out of that fog and I improved, and luckily I'm a therapist by background, so I knew what was happening. I knew this is postpartum depression. I have to go get help. Many other women do not have that privilege and ability to do that. But after I got out of that fog and I started to look, and I was like, okay, there was a difference between that kind of depression that I went through all through my youth and teen college years, very different from what I experienced very much chemically after having a child. And when I looked back at what that meant for me, I realized that when I was younger, it was more about feeling like I didn't matter, low self-esteem. But after I had a baby, you couldn't have given me anything and it would have made me improve. My chemicals are probably all over the place. There was nothing until I got, therapy and medication, hormones regulated, until I could feel better again. And so I started to see that difference. It's like, okay, well, we should be viewing this differently. We're viewing everyone as kind of like me with postpartum, where, hey, it's a chemical imbalance and we need to treat this as a medical issue. And in many cases we do. When I could have had my whole childhood probably picked if someone would have just taken the time to talk to me and been like, hey, you're here for a reason and you can do things, you're accomplished, we respect you, we love you. So missing those messages and then seeing those two differences in my own life are really what inspired me to try and help employers and everyone see that we can't treat this all the same way.
That is such a wonderful, profoundly moving story, Susie. Thank you for sharing that, because you
Thanks.
have now said what so many of us have tried to explain. But when one person has gone through both and you're able to say, here's the difference, and stop just throwing medication at somebody, that there has to be something more than that in terms of change. Now, can you take that a little further? Because when you were younger, you were in school, it was family, it was friends. So in the workplace, when someone's feeling like you did, what are the things that you would suggest first from a leader and then from a coworker?
So let me make sure I understand the question. If I'm an employee feeling depressed or stressed or whatever, and then how would I
How
talk to
could a
someone?
leader, how could the leader help you? And how could the coworker support you?
Yes. Oh gosh, that is such a great question. So one, leaders need to know, first and foremost, no one is expecting them to make a diagnosis and share a treatment plan. No leader should ever say, I think you're depressed. You might need to go get help. No. And I think, in fact, many leaders are kind of afraid to have these conversations because they feel like that's all of a sudden what they have to become, a therapist. And what if someone opens up to me? I don't know what to say. You don't need to do anything like that. You need to be able to just say to someone, hey, I care about you and I've noticed something different. I can tell, maybe it's you're showing up to work late, you seem less interested. And you mean so much to me that I want to make sure you get the help that you need. This team values you. I value you. Let's talk through this. Here's some resources that we have. Here's what you have. Maybe they have meditation apps, employee assistance. Here's these resources that we have. What can I do for you? What do you need? I think that's probably the first conversation to have. And of course, I think the big picture, though, leaders, of course, might benefit from having things like, training in emotional intelligence and whatnot, just to kind of help them get more in touch with their own self and soul and whatnot in order to be able to have these conversations and feel a human to human contact. From the coworker side, pretty similar. It doesn't ever have to be, I can, I was depressed and you look like that too, so you probably need medication like me. But also make sure if a coworker is not just completely ignoring and not talking to someone, because that's even worse. If you're saying, I think this person's depressed and I don't know, I'm just going to kind of stay away because she seems really upset, that's going to be even worse. So from a coworker similar perspective, just to be able to say, I can tell something's wrong. Are you okay? Do you want to talk through something? What can I do to help you? How can I support? And it's especially important for all employees, I think, to be mental health champions and also be aware of all the resources that the employer has to say, did you know that we have this? This is a really great service. I've used it before too. So again, I just think it's about talking to another human being. Stop treating it as, oh, there is a sick person who may be crazy or violent, and those stigmas that we hold, and just talk to them as another human being than trying to make connection.
Yeah. How are you doing? How are you really doing?
Yeah.
And having that conversation. I'm still blown away by your story, Suzy, but let's go back to your 1 in 5, because it was actually Dr. Ron Kessler, who's out of Harvard University, who said that the 1 in 5 statistic that we have actually came from people with a diagnosis. And he said, if you really looked at people who are going through a time in their lives where they weren't sleeping, as you say, they're not eating, or they're eating too much, they're self-medicating, they're ruminating, meaning going around and around with negative thoughts all the time. He said, it's more like 1 in 2 that we will all have that experience.
Yes.
And you said to me in something that you wrote that you feel that this 1 in 5 is othering, meaning we're talking about those people, but you feel strongly we need to talk about us people. And I feel the same way. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you mean by that, Suzy, and how we can change it?
Yeah. It struck me, it was maybe a year or so ago. I was sitting there and thinking about how long we have been trying, people like you and I and those in the space, how long we've been trying to break the stigma. And I was sitting there thinking like, I've been around the space for about 20 years. Like, how come it hasn't happened yet? It's gotten tons better, right? Over these last few decades, it's way better than it ever was before. I never 5 years ago would have shared that story about my own mental health. I would have been way too worried that so we've made leaps and bounds of improvements. But that said, going back and looking back at the stigma and what we could be doing in the 1 in 5, so many things run through my head. Yes. Okay. So as humans, so this is what I thought about with the thing that I was just saying there. I'm like going to so many tangents in my head here. When we're saying it's kind of like the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So here we are, we keep trying to break the stigma. We keep trying to raise awareness, and which is great. I don't want to discredit any of that. But when I thought about it, I'm like, but we keep trying to normalize it and destigmatize it for people who have a mental health issue. So that allows all of us to say, well, sure, I'll normalize this. I'll normalize it for that 1 in 5, that person who has a mental health issue. So we're constantly able to kind of say that it's someone else's problem, like, sure, yeah, okay, I'll normalize it, and I'll make sure that people feel like they can talk about it for that one person that has this, not me. I don't have any issues at all. And so I think the more and more that we're kind of allowing ourselves to say that we're doing this for those who have a mental health issue, for those who are struggling and suffering, the more we do that, the more we're allowing us to say, it's not on me, this is someone else, and I'll just make it better for them. And I truly think that if we're really going to make an improvement of this, if we're really going to try and actually break the stigma, we have to acknowledge and understand that mental health is in all of us. We all have this. If you felt stressed this morning driving to work because someone cut you off, that's your mental health, and you take care of it. And so that was what kind of struck me about this. I was like, we're othering, we're making it about, someone else and not making it inclusive. Having mental health is a human being experience. We were put on this planet not to just have everything be sunshine and roses. Struggle is a part of our human experience. And instead of us saying, hey, sometimes beauty comes out of this struggle, wonderful things comes out of struggle, and you wouldn't know happiness if you didn't know sadness, we push it away and say sadness is bad, you can't feel sad, it's mentally ill, you're depressed, etc. So I think until we can get to the point where we can all collectively acknowledge and say, I have mental health, and then it's not 1 in 5, it's all of us.
Yeah, that's great. And, I think about grief in particular, that it's such a normal experience, and you can't feel grief or loss unless you had something that you somehow enjoyed or wanted to be around, whether it's a person or a job, or you can't feel the loss of it as sadness unless you ever loved it or enjoyed it at some point. And that is tough for people to understand. And even here, sometimes we see that somebody's dealing with a loss and they say, well, it's been 6 months, you should be over it.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, no, actually, that's not true. That it's
right.
You integrate loss into your life. So you talk about emotions as being on a continuum, and you even sent me a lovely chart about that. Can you talk a little bit about why we have this whole gamut of emotions and what that is?
Yeah, I'm sure anyone listening understands, right? We can have experience on one end of the spectrum, joy and happiness and complete elation, and then can go all the way to the other side of feeling completely depressed, lost, and suicidal. And I think, unfortunately, too many employers have focused just on that depressed, suicidal piece. And that's where their strategies and tactics and money are going there, is to invest in those, when we have someone already off work for however many months, paying, helping with the medical treatment for someone that's in the hospital for a suicide attempt. And we really don't do enough on the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, if someone's feeling really great, we actually want to do what we can to keep that going. We want to do that. But there's so much we can be doing earlier on to support resilience, growth mindset, things like that in our employees to help them thrive. And I'm a firm believer too of just, as I was talking about before, helping people find a sense of meaning and belonging in work, and feeling included, and psychological safety in the workplace is a big part of this intervention piece and prevention piece that we could be doing early on with this range of emotions that we have, as opposed to just waiting till the end and waiting till someone has said, I can't do this anymore and I'm at the end of my rope.
So Susie, what do you say to the employer who says, I take care of your meaning, I pay you? Like, I'm not your therapist, I'm not your family, and what
Yeah.
more do you want from me?
Well, I'd tell them that they're probably going to find someone that's going to leave the company, because there's other employers out there that will take care of them for that. The workforce has changed dramatically. You hear about the Great Resignation and things like that, and so right now, I'd say to anyone feeling or thinking that way of like, oh boy, you might want to change your mindset real fast, because there's a lot of employers that are understanding compassionate leadership, as we're talking about psychological safety, and employees now, there's so many jobs available that of course they can just jump ship and go and find something that will give them that meaning that they want. That said, that's probably my dream of what I would like to say to someone, hey, someone's going to walk out on you for like that. But oh gosh, I mean, to have a heart to heart with someone that's probably that closed off is tough. But letting someone know, I mean, I'll get deep here again. If someone has that type of feeling of, hey, I pay you, do your job, I would go back. I would think, probably, this is the therapist in me, is going to think that person had some type of trauma in their past that they feel like they can't allow emotions then, and to feel compassionate and connected there. If someone has that kind of perspective, gosh, they really need to do some work and talk to their own type of coach or mentor and say, I'm struggling to find connection with my employees. It's such an outdated way of thinking now. I mean, that was years ago. That was it, right? People went to work to get a paycheck. People go to work now to find meaning, I believe.
So now again, you give me all these different nuggets, Susie. So I want to look at two different things. So you've given us the why they might say no, why they might not be focused on doing that. But now tell us the how. If they need to change from that mindset to a mindset that is more realistic about finding how to support meaning and purpose in a workplace where that's not been traditionally there. How do they do that?
A couple things come to mind. If you do have something like an employee assistance program, many of them, like where I work, we have a lot of trainings that we offer to managers. So group, trainings and curriculums to help leaders understand emotional intelligence, being compassionate, mental health, first aid, etc. So that's an easy kind of first step to do that. But I would encourage anyone going through that to find their own coach, et cetera, or some type of peer learning group, or training again in the group setting on emotional intelligence, something like that, to kind of help get out why it is that you're holding this belief that you've held for so long. Understandably, that was kind of programmed into many leaders' heads decades ago. We get that, but it's going to take a little work and introspection and opening up to kind of peel back those layers. So I'd say between some trainings and there's some organizations out there that do kind of small peer learning groups. I have some friends that do that if anyone needs a recommendation. And then finding your own type of coach or someone to help walk you through peeling back those layers. It doesn't have to be not a therapy session at all, by any means, but just helping to peel back layers of, you have these old beliefs. How do we reshape those? And what can you do if you want to be a better leader, which I believe all of them do? This is a really great thing for you to do that.
You mentioned that your go-to would be to say, oh, wow, I wonder what's going on for that person, that they have that belief. And Susie, that was a big turning point in my life, going from they don't like me, they're doing this to me, they're being unfair to me, to I wonder what's going on for them. It changed everything, because suddenly I was not the overly sensitive, constantly insecure and hurt person. Now I was the curious person. So can you talk a little bit more for people who still are very reactive to other people's own issues? How can, for me, it was one of those, I say, virtual slap upside the head, but other people would say it in a much kinder way, like a light bulb moment. How did you come to understand that in your life?
Understanding
that people do what they do to manage their pain, to fill their void, or
gotcha.
yeah.
Oh, I mean, being trained as a therapist, I think it was probably taught to me in one of my courses. I think now, especially over these last few years that we've had here in the States of a lot of disparity and injustice, I really had to, even though, like I said, I've learned this in school, but when I found myself really feeling like, gosh, it's us or them, we're so divided. And how could he feel this way? How could she have this belief? How could she vote this way? When I started to kind of feel and get pulled into that, I was like, I cannot keep living like this. This is not the way I want to be. I wasn't ever like this before, but now the way the world is, I'm starting to feel myself being pulled in these types of directions. And so I thought to myself, how do I get through this? How do I get to a place where, because I can't keep living each day with anger and hatred in my heart and blaming other people. Luckily I opened up to some friends about this and some really great colleagues that I have. And one of my buddies had talked to me a whole lot about pretty much empathy and understanding. Empathy, as we know, is, seeing something from someone else's perspective. It's not just seeing something from someone else. It's actually putting yourself in their shoes and seeing it through their lens. And so when I can look at other people, and if I stop and just pause for a moment to realize that someone's just not, how could they think this way? They're wrong and I'm right. But to look through that lens of, okay, what were their experiences? I think those social determinants of health, where did they grow up? What kind of education did they have? What maybe traumas occurred in their life. All these things, like if I see it through that lens, I can understand why they might feel that way. We both want the same outcomes. It's just we're seeing different ways to get there because of those experiences. And so I think really digging into and understanding and pausing for empathy is what has helped me most.
Yeah, I say if I had lived their life, had their experiences, and had their thoughts, I would probably feel and do the same thing, because that's what shapes us. But then we can learn more. It's like here, and I'm sure it's in the States too, that there was a lot of animosity between people who did not want the vaccine and people who did want the vaccine. And like you, I wanted to understand both sides. And what I found was that both sides are motivated by fear. Fear of COVID meant that they were passionate about getting the vaccine, and fear of the vaccine meant they were passionate about not getting it. But it was fear that was driving both sides. And, there's all the talk about science, but when we're afraid, there's no amount of science or logic that can break through that. We have to and with science, as we know, we've always been able to find science, so-called, at least science, to back up whatever we want, right?
Yes, whichever way that may be. But you're absolutely right, how much fear drives all of us, in any way. Someday, I think, years and years from now, luckily nowadays we're talking about psychological health and safety and things like mindfulness, which again, 10 years ago in a manufacturing setting, I couldn't have been talking about mindfulness. And I think one day, I hope we can get to talking more about purpose in the workplace. And then to your point there, I hope we can start talking more about love, because to me, that's the opposite of the fear spectrum. Not the type of love you may feel for, husband, children, etc., but just understanding love instead of fear and bringing that into a workplace setting in order to kind of help some of those big hurdles that we're talking about.
Yes. And it's just language, right? Because love to me is wanting the best for you. And not at the expense of myself or the expense of someone else, but wanting the best for everybody is what love is. And so when we have that messed up with sex or intimacy or, loyalty or, other ideas of what is love, then the language in a workplace is like, what are you talking about, Suzy? We're not doing.
Don't say that word here. Our corporate environment.
Yeah, but let's start with mindfulness because I am currently working to introduce concepts to some of the types of workplaces that this would be completely foreign to.
Oh, sure.
And I use the term because it's a safety sensitive place, focus.
Yep.
Let's see how we can improve focus. And of course, mindfulness does that. But can you talk a little bit about in the places where you have been able to introduce it? How did you do so?
You know what, you're pretty much hitting it right on the nose there, is that having to find the right language to use. Because again, coming from a very corporate environment within a manufacturing setting, gosh, I remember one time I tried to do a wellness campaign on the science of happiness, and some labor relation and union guys were like, "You cannot talk about happiness to our guys that are working 16 hours." I'm like, "I'm not telling people to put a smile on their face and it'll be better. I'm talking about the science behind it." That's it aside. It was very similar with mindfulness, of just having to, as I call it, maybe to mindfulness light, where it is just using a different type of word, focused or being present, and then talking about the benefits of, right, we all want to be safe. We need to improve our safety here. And if we're, multitasking and doing different things, right, that's going to cause more accidents. So trying to find that, kind of common tie that people are looking for, that outcome that everyone wants, and saying, this is what's going to help us get to that. And I think sometimes then once you introduce, and it's kind of like dipping your toe in the water of like, hey, you got people, at least they're talking about this. Because now, I mean, I can't believe it. Like, the same experience as you. And now I have companies, when I was in consulting, people ask me, there's all these different mindfulness apps. Which one should I get for my employees? And I'm like, oh, how did this happen? So I think we're doing those right steps by just taking baby steps and trying to introduce the basic concepts of it and helping people to see all the benefits. And then they want more.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is all of this new agey woo-woo stuff, as some
Yeah.
people call it,
Yeah.
really helps improve quality of life, but it also helps improve quality of work. It supports creativity, supports focus and attention, and yeah, but like you say, we have to be satisfied with the baby steps so
Yes.
that we can introduce it. And then when they see the benefit, then it's no longer pushing a boulder uphill. Now it's
Right.
like, oh, I see that
Absolutely.
and I want to do that. Um, so let's go on to some of the things that you have seen in your career in those workplaces that do start to evolve, that do start to
Mm.
implement psychological health and safety. And what's the change that they see? What do they experience?
Well, one, I kind of want to take a step back for a second, because there's a difference in how they're doing it compared to others. First, for example, there's a lot of employers that are trying to look for a quick point solution in hopes that that will, magically cure it. No one's depressed anymore because we put in this one thing for everyone. And so I think for those that understand the difference between, I'm not just trying to add more counselors to my networks that more people can see therapists. Like, that's great. We want that. That's absolutely, but don't just stop there. You can't just stop there. As we're talking about, to actually create a culture of psychological safety takes a whole lot of strategic planning and road mapping, to do that. And of course, then, I mean, gosh, the benefits, everything from financially, that fewer, claims out for mental health, fewer emergency room visits, fewer accidents, fewer, as I'm talking about, short-term and long-term disability claims. There's a ton of money to save that you will save. So instead of saying, I mean, gosh, you know how it is now, and no, I don't mean to say anything bad about it, but we have vendors for diabetes, weight gain, obesity, musculoskeletal issue, and employers will buy these solutions to fix that, instead of saying, let's look at our own culture, because stress is linked to almost every chronic condition out there. So instead of saying we'll pay money and invest in all these solutions to, fix people that are broken, how about we look inside and see what's happening here? Are leaders trained to be, our leaders trained, well enough to be emotionally intelligent and to be, to foster that psychologically safe environment? Do our employees feel this way? So investing in all of that, I would say not just what I was talking about, is all those different, point solutions later and financially, but also retention and attraction. People want to come to a culture that they hear about is, an amazing place to work where they feel like they belong. So both, from the, like I said, attraction, retention perspective, but also then the financial benefit as well.
Yeah, it's like we could have an emergency room on site, or we could have steel-toed boots and hard hats and reduce the need for it.
Right. And when you say that, it's interesting because right when you're in those settings and you see people with hard hats, we do that, but we don't do that for people emotionally or mentally. Physically, we'll make sure that you don't get injured here. So we'll give you a hard hat, but we don't prepare our employees or give them what they need to prevent some emotional damage down the line.
Well, and I was with a colleague whose field is the construction trade in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the construction trade has one of the highest rates of suicide.
Yep.
And he said, we've got to start to talk about things and not just have that macho suck it up attitude, because we don't have enough workers. So it's like, okay, now we're at the stage where we have to do something because it is a crisis. What if employers decided to do things as prevention instead?
Absolutely. I mean, that's my biggest kind of thorn in the side, after once COVID hit. I was thrilled to see how many employers suddenly became interested in mental health. When I was in consulting there, we had all of a sudden all these employers saying, what do we do? How do we help support emotional health? So it's been amazing to see this shift. It needs to last now. It needs to continue on. We need to make sure that employers don't just say at this point, hey, things are going back to normal and we're going to let it go. So hopefully go back. We need to be doing way more on the prevention piece of it instead of waiting and buying, more solutions at the end when people have hit the end of their rope.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to talk to, say, a mid-size organization who said, Suzy, we agree with you. We want to take this window of opportunity where we're going to regroup, hopefully post-pandemic. And what is your advice? What should we do differently now?
Oh gosh, where to begin? The first thing jumping in my mind is top down, bottom up. Leaders, I think, really set the best example. And anytime I get to talk with my clients and the leaders in human resource, I always say, you have a better impact on your employee mental health than I do as a mental health therapist. Employees look to their leaders. They set the example. If there's a time off and vacation policy and they don't see their manager doing it, employees aren't going to do it either because they're too worried. So I would say if anyone's ready to make this change, to get your leaders up to speed on how to talk about mental health, how to identify it, how to be comfortable with it, to feel like it's not their responsibility, but it should be a part of their job, that they know how to do this. It's not a job duty per se, but it kind of is. Like, you don't have to diagnose and treat people, but you need to be able to talk through this and see if someone's struggling and get them connected to resources. So getting leaders trained in everything you're saying there too about psychological safety, what they can do to help people feel like it's okay to share their ideas, et cetera. And also allowing for grassroots type of efforts too, allowing employees to become mental health champions, to create, maybe not, we call them employee resource groups, but employee networks that support mental health and inclusion and things like that, to give employees a voice in that. Another thing I would say too is communicating and talking about the resources that they have, and keeping them top of mind. Typically, I come from the EAP space. Someone's not telling their employee about the EAP until that person is crying or shows up under the influence. And then they say, oh, by the way, we have this resource. Coming from manufacturing, we ended every meeting with a reminder to everyone, here's your employee assistance program, here's other resources for you. Safety meetings were kicked off at that. Every new leader that came in as part of their orientation had an hour where they learned all about our mental health resources. Every month, it shouldn't just be, hey, May is Mental Health Awareness Month here in the States, so we're just going to talk about it in May. It has to be talked about all the time as a reminder so that it's part of the culture, not just a one and done. I've always said too, I think the things that employers can do to really improve mental health are pretty much low or no cost. I mean, the things that I was talking about right now don't cost anything. You don't have to wait and buy $1 million point solution. You can do all these little things that'll improve that culture. You don't have to spend a ton of money on it.
Yes. You talk about employee resource groups, and of
Mhm.
course, around inclusivity,
Mhm.
that can be so important, right? To have employees who are grappling with these issues and then they advise. But smaller employers think, well, I can't have all these things. I don't have HR. We don't have thousands of employees
Sure.
to draw from. However, your 4 employees could have an employee lunch once a quarter where they talk about ideas to make it better. And together they
Mhm.
come back and say, hey, boss, these are some of the things we thought about. And maybe they're even tasked with, how can we make it affordable? How can we make that work for us? And
Yes.
still have that feedback.
Yeah,
So there's
absolutely. Small groups, it's almost easier, but they probably don't feel that way, right? Like, hey, we can't afford these big, solutions. Like, but you have a small group, you can raise awareness so fast. When you're, an employer that's 100,000 employees, it's, with locations everywhere, it's hard to get that word out. In fact, if you've got a small group, you have an even better ability to reach everyone in your company to say, this is a priority. Your mental health is a priority to us.
Yeah. So tell me how we can support you to be
Hmm.
well at work, right? How
Yep.
can we support that? And inclusivity here, so whether we're talking about diversity, equity,
Hmm.
inclusion, accessibility, is an ongoing issue
Yeah.
because of what we call implicit or unconscious bias. And just by
Mm-hmm.
its nature, we are not aware of it.
Yep.
Do you have, through your work, ideas, especially for small to medium employers, about what they could do about that to move that forward?
I mean, there's a lot of trainings available out there on unconscious bias, which is great, but I think real change happens when it's more part of a group discussion and it's not just one time. So whether you have someone that's kind of facilitating that group or whether you're trying to just find it on your own, is being able to be in a, kind of a peer-to-peer or group learning session, to be able to say, okay, here's what I've done. I'm realizing that I've believed this, educating yourself about it, and then being able to talk through, calling yourself out on what things you've done, but then not just, having this one discussion. If you can then partner up and then you're talking once a month about, okay, let's talk back about what we've learned. Let's talk about what things I've done, really celebrate what things I've done really well at. Let's talk about ways that we can improve. So I think, it doesn't need to be a lot of money invested in this, but just making sure it's to really learn the concept and keep it alive. It has to be, brought to life through some of this discussion and then continued discussions on, until I don't think it ever disappears. You can say, oh, we're not, we don't have any bias anymore. Keeping those really, keeping those conversations going.
I really like that, Suzy, because it's very simple to put into a team meeting. Is, we ask on our one-on-ones or in our team meetings is, how has somebody at work supported your mental health? And it's
Mm,
really trying to call each other out on the things that we've done well.
yeah.
But asking, how have people allowed you to feel included, that you belong to this group? It could be another way to do that. I had one of the experts in inclusion say that a very simple exercise is to ask, when have you felt that you really belonged part of a team
Oh, I
at
love
work,
that.
any
Yeah.
work, and why did you? What was going on? And then, have you ever felt less than belonging in a group, and what was going on then? And just letting the team members hear that is like, oh, that little thing made you feel like you belonged. I can do that. Or
Yes.
that that omission made you feel like you didn't. And I never thought to ask, your opinion, or I never thought to say thanks for that idea. I just ran with it, you
Yeah.
know?
And isn't that great? Because I think so many people don't want to, they're afraid of doing some type of unconscious bias training because they assume they're going to be accused of something.
Right.
Like someone's going to call them out and say, you're doing this wrong and you're doing that, when it's not about that. Those questions you were just phrasing, they were just beautiful.
Yeah, well, of course they are beautiful, but they weren't mine. But
Yeah.
yeah, whether it's this podcast or some of the roundtables or forums that I get to host, I'm always learning and inspired by people like yourselves, Suzy, and being able to share it back is a gift. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Believe it or not, we're coming up to the end of our time. I'm just wondering if there's other points that you really wanted to share and get across.
Oh, some of the things I've kind of mentioned and sprinkled throughout, for employers to not just think of, we need to invest in just treating mental health issues, and we just need to make sure our employees have more counselors to see. And yes, there's a shortage of mental health providers. I get that. And it's absolutely critical that we help that. But don't stop there. Having investing a lot of money in solutions is great, but that can't be your strategy if you actually want. I've done a ton of employee listening sessions. I got to tell you, I've never heard someone, when I say, what can your employer do, to help you, your mental health? I've never heard anyone say, it'd be great if I had more access to more therapists. They're talking about, they never say it. They talk about, I need to feel like I can be flexible with my hours. I need to feel like I can use my vacation. I need more work-life balance. So, to make sure that everyone knows or all employers know to just think more broadly about this, and to make sure of including things like I mentioned, that having a lack of belonging, a lack of purpose will also make your employees be sick, be stressed, miss time at work, be absent from work, etc. And I guess finally is, I always like to say to humanize mental health. I love that we're trying to normalize mental health, and we should never stop that journey, but we need to humanize it and realize that, for leaders, for employees too, if we really want to move forward with this and we really want to be able to take care of our mental health, we need to realize that it's a part of our human experience. There's nothing wrong with this. So we're not flawed and we're not sick. I mean, yes, I've been sick, but we are human. We are human. Treat people as humans, not just as employees that are creating a product for you.
Yeah, beautiful. And my last question to you is one that I like to ask. For you to describe a psychologically healthy and safe workplace to someone who has no idea what that concept is, and let them know what it feels like, what it would look like.
I think it would start probably at the recruiting end. When you're bringing new people into the company, that's part of your interview process, is setting that stage that this is our culture and how are you going to contribute to that. So make sure everyone you're bringing in understands this is part of the job. Making sure then so that's part of that. It's maybe even a part of performance reviews, and I don't even like performance reviews, but just talking about a piece of it of, hey, how are you, we're also measuring and talking about this. How are you helping to contribute to a psychologically safe workforce? What are you doing this year? What are your plans this year to continue that going? It would look like that as well. It would look like people in any meeting having their hand up, raising because they feel it's okay to speak and to be able to share. Might look like fewer accidents because people weren't hesitant to say, I think something's wrong and we're doing something wrong. I would think too, so yeah, recruiting I talked about, and the environment. Yeah, I think that's kind of off the top of my head, the few things there. And probably then those outcomes that we talked about, you'd see less people leaving the company, less people missing work, more people feeling engaged, and more people reporting, those employee engagement surveys, probably a lot more positive, saying that they tell other people to come work there. They love coming to work each day.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for that. And Suzy, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, wanted to chat with you, how would they do that?
Yeah, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn, Suzy Clausen. Email too is sclausen@curalink.com. That's CURALINC. So feel free to email me as well. Either one of those ways. I'm kind of always a LinkedIn nut, so you can find me there too.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh,
I
thank you,
really
Marianne.
This podcast will show up on psychealthandsafetycanada.com. It'll also be on the Flourish DX YouTube if they want to see the video as well. And I will go on LinkedIn and make sure that you know the day that this comes out, Suzy.
Awesome.
And copy you on that.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity. This has been awesome.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.